Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our Why Polygyny series. In previous videos, we spoke about the biological implications of polygyny, how male and females are predisposed towards polygyny biologically. We spoke about how certain women actually prefer polygynous unions, um, or discreetly prefer polygynous unions, although they're not honest with themselves about it often. And now we are going to talk about some of the social implications of polygyny, and also I wanted to speak about the economic theory, or the theory of demand and supply, in relation to polygyny. So let us get into it. So first thing to note is that when we mentioned that the ability of men to impregnate several, women or hundreds of women, we only looked at things from a biological perspective. Of course, because unions and pair bonding involves more than just the biological aspect, involves more than just having sexual relations. Because of course the natural consequence of sexual relations is, offspring or children. We find that there will need to be constraints on human sexual behavior. And so these constraints, of course, we find largely within the domain of religion. Religion has placed constraints on sexual behavior. One of the main constraints, of course, firstly, is the constraint against incest. That is, people are not to have sexual relations with, their blood relatives. And then the second, major constraint, obviously placed by religion, is the constraint on not having sexual relations with women who are already with a partner. So women who are already married, are off limits, because they are only to have sexual relations with a lawful spouse. So that is another constraint that has been placed on people's sexual behavior by religion, which we otherwise call, obviously, not commit adultery. And that obviously, the first constraint obviously is for the, maintenance of genetic soundness in the human species. When you have people close in blood relatives mating, aside from that being unnatural, it's also causes the degeneration of the human genes. So that's, a big no-no. You'll have children, more people with Down syndrome and things like that. The second one, of course, mating with someone who already has a mate, meaning sleeping with a married woman, of course. It's called adultery because it's the adulteration of semen, meaning the mixing of two men's semen in one woman. That is called adulteration. So we call it adultery, basically. Causes a disconnect between the father and the children, because now we don't know who is the real father of the children. But besides, of course, that can be worked out with technology these days. But besides that, it also causes instability and hostility, in society and amongst men, because men generally don't like sharing women, for, many reasons. So those are sort of some natural limits, or the natural limits, that we would otherwise call religion or instigated by religion. But in reality, it's also just limits that have evolved through human nature and those three principles we spoke about in the very beginning. So when we look at these limitations, obviously these limitations are for the betterment of society and for the furtherance of civilization. there's also another limitation, and that is basically the idea that if a man were to sleep with, several women, and that woman then become, his woman, he would then be responsible to take care of all those women and sire and be responsible for all those children that come from those women. So he is not to take more women, he's not to take so many women, that he cannot feasibly, look after, basically. So he's not to have more women than he can look after. And so those are like limitations imposed by the social reality, okay? And obviously it's not disjointed. We tend to fragment, or we tend to compartmentalize things in the interest of discussion, but obviously the social reality is not disconnected from the biological reality, because if you sire children who are otherwise not competent or not capable, or are basically degenerates, it will not be good for the furtherance of civilization and therefore the species. So it's all interconnected, okay? But these are the social realities. And so how does this really play out? And this is where I want to talk about the economic theory of demand and supply. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, who haven't done economics or haven't done a high school course in economics, the demand and supply theory basically works, as follows. If you have 100 loaves of bread, let's use bread, okay? If you have 100 loaves of bread and you have 5 people, okay, and in reality these 5 people only need 10 loaves of bread, okay, then there is a surplus of loaves of bread. And because there is a surplus of loaves of bread, in order for the seller to sell these loaves of bread, he will sell them for a very low price. He will sell them for very cheap in order to actually sell them. So that's called where demand meets supply. So where the demand will meet the supply will be at a very, low cost. The price of bread will fall because there's a surplus of bread, okay? Alternately, if we turn it around and we say, okay, there are 100 people, okay, but only 10 loaves of bread, but each one of these 100, people want 1 loaf of bread. Well, then they have to start bidding for the bread, okay? And the price of the bread will skyrocket, okay? And the bread will be sold to those who put in the highest bid, okay? So instead of now people being able to buy 10 loaves of bread for the price of 1, they will have to pay 10 times as much for 1 loaf of bread. So the reverse will happen. So this is kind of the demand and supply theory. How does this apply to polygyny? Okay, because we see this happening today a lot, okay? You see, when women are freely accessible and there is sexual communism, there is a surplus of woman. Now, what I mean by surplus of woman is I don't mean statistically that women outnumber men. Okay, in many ways, women of marriageable age do outnumber men of marriageable age. But if you go down the graphs, for most countries, it's about even. The ratio of men to women in the world, is about even. I mean, across the age demographic. I mean, if you compress the ages basically into one category, then it would be around about 50-50 in many countries. Of course, it would differ from city to city, and it differs it differs according to age categories. But we don't want to go into the whole statistical thing, because it's kind of not, it's pointless to have to go into that, because it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. Okay, what we're talking about is demand and supply. So essentially, when there is a surplus of women, meaning that women are easily accessible and readily available, then the value of women go down, right? So again, women become like the 100 loaves of bread, that's available to purchase by only 10 men, because women are in surplus, not in number, but because of sexual communism, meaning women are free to just have sex with willy-nilly with as many guys as they like, and so guys are obviously as free to have sex with as many women as they like, and therefore the value of women drop. Okay. However, if there's chastity in the society, meaning women do not sleep around willy-nilly, because at the end of the day, women are the gatekeepers. Women are actually the cornerstone of morality in society, because unless, of course, men are vile and are raping women, which is not the often the case in societies. Men do rape. There are men who rape women, but not every man is a rapist. Basically, few men are rapists. So what happens is, when you have women who guard themselves and who don't sleep willy-nilly around, well, guess what? Then it becomes harder for men to obtain women, and the value of a woman go up. Men have to work harder, right, to have a woman. Now, let us just fast forward a bit. How do we get this level of chastity? Well, frankly, through polygyny, okay? Because the problem we have a lot with monogamy is that because a man can only lawfully pair bond with one woman in monogamous societies, or societies that profess to be monogamous, because very often we find that they are not really monogamous, what happens is that there are always a lot of unmarried women, okay? And there are a lot of unmarried women not because there are not men they can marry, but there are not men that they want to marry, because the men they really want to marry are already married, okay? And so what happens is you find a lot of women chasing for the top 20% of guys. The top 20% of guys are already with women. They are already married. And then you have a lot of guys who are single and a lot of girls who are single, who are basically practicing sexual communism. And so you have a society where the value of women deteriorates, okay? Because men don't have to work hard or compete for a diminishing number of women. No, men can quite easily have women willy-nilly, and so do not have to better themselves in order to cater for women's natural hypergamy. Okay? Why? Since the top 20% of men are only allowed to have one wife, okay, there isn't a threat that they just may marry more women, reducing the number of women available and forcing the other categories of men to try to work harder to secure a mate. And so in this sense, polygyny is actually more beneficial for society, and more beneficial for women, because it increases the value of woman simply by creating an artificial scarcity, okay, a perceived scarcity, okay. There's a good possibility in a society that encourages polygyny, that were you a man who did not try to be on your A game, there's a good possibility that woman might rather opt to marry an already married man than marry you, okay? Which means that you would have to work that much harder. You can't be a loser, a total loser. You can't be someone with no ambition or low ambition and no direction in your life and still secure a mate, because there's no surplus of women, okay? There aren't women who can't secure a mate, okay? Because the fact is that highly successful men on the top, on the upper scheme of things, were they polygynous, like as in married women responsibly in polygyny, they would possibly marry women who would have otherwise been less appealing were they limited to monogamy, okay? Because what polygyny does allow for men is that, in a sense, that polygyny allows men to marry women for different reasons, basically, okay? Instead of having to marry one woman and expect that one woman to tick all the boxes, or to meet all demands of the man can marry woman who meet some of these demands in different ways. So one woman might be highly intelligent and very industrious. Another woman might be more domesticated. Another woman might be very affectionate and loving, and another woman might be whatever, but he can basically afford to marry women and accommodate their shortcomings more readily, and not expect to marry the perfect woman because or expect perfection from a woman, because he will not be confined to one woman. So that means women who would have otherwise either have to settle for a man who is less than capable because they lack appeal, or would just participate in the sexual communism of lower quality people, basically, can now uplift herself through marrying up, and being accepted for her shortcomings, in other words. So that sort of improves the society over time, since people are always aiming higher, as women in any case naturally do, and not having to settle for just anyone because they happen to be single. And also it forces men to value women more, because they become they are potentially scarce, and so that's kind of what you have. The other way around, which is what we have today, is where basically the value of woman is seen as very low, to the extent that you find guys like in these men going their own way type movements, MGTOW movements, literally saying that, look, we don't want to have a long-term relationship, we don't want to get married because we don't think it's worth it. That's how low value women have become. That men are even saying we don't want to actually be with a woman. which is extremely unnatural thing to say, obviously, for men. But that's how low value women have become by, commodifying their sexuality, and not, confining themselves to one man, and not practicing uh, chastity, and also by men not practicing polygyny, but instead opting for sexual communism. So that is the end of this segment. Hope it stimulates your thoughts around polygyny, and feel free to leave your comments. Thank you very much.